And good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a pleasant Wednesday morning, and I hope God has blessed you richly today and will continue to bless you richly. We're going to be in session 8, and the title of it is Serves in our quarterly today, and it's on page 73. And we're going to be taking the lesson from Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. Now, most people are served by somebody in a typical day. If you go to a restaurant, they'll bring you water and then bring you food, and you're served. Uh, Sometimes if you're out driving, a driver will let you cut in front of him, and let you get into the line of traffic if you're stopped at a red light and you're trying to get into that flow. Sometimes the driver will let you get that. But how often are we grateful for those acts of service? Or do we just rudely get upset when the waiter doesn't meet our standards? Do we cut someone off in traffic even though somebody just let us in? How grateful are we for these things? Gratefulness for the sacrifices of others should change the way we live. Jesus gave his life as the ultimate sacrifice. He served humanity. Let's do a little bit of understanding the text today, and that's going to be taken from Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 53. Now, what we're going to discuss first is from Mark chapter 10, verses 1. It says that while Jesus was teaching a crowd in the region of Judah across the Jordan, a group of Pharisees approached Jesus with a question about divorce. He answered it by pointing them to the commands of Moses and presenting them with God's ideal for marriage. And then we see a little later on that as people were bringing their children to Jesus so he would bless them, the disciples got mad and told them to go away. They were indignant over Jesus was indignant over the disciples' behavior. He told them to bring the children to him. He taught that entering God's kingdom meant coming like a child. Then he blessed the children in verses 13 through 16 in chapter 10. Then we see as Jesus journeyed with his disciples, he went on his journey, and a wealthy young man came up to him and asked him, Good master, what should I do to get into the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus told him, Sell all that you have and give to the poor and follow me. Well, we've seen the young man had great riches, and he decided he couldn't depart from them because that riches were his idol instead of God being his ruler. He let the idol control him. So now we're going to see as we start today's lesson that they were getting closer to Jerusalem, and Jesus told his disciples a third time what would happen to him there. That he would be handed over to the religious leaders and the Gentiles, and he would be mocked, tortured, killed, and he would rise again after 3 days. Then we see that James and John then approached Jesus, asking for places of honor at his right and his left hand. Now let's go on into today's lesson and see what develops as we go into this. And that's going to be taken from chapter 10, verses 32 through 34 to start with. We're going to do verse 32 first. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were astonished, but those who followed him were afraid. Taking the 12 aside again, he began to tell them things that would happen to him. Now, for the third time in 3 chapters, Jesus announced his approaching death to disciples. They were on the road going to Jerusalem as he told them this. They were headed toward the city where Jesus would die. He explained to the disciples the shocking events that would happen to him in the coming days. Now we see that 2 groups were following Jesus. He had his disciples and other followers who were following him. Now the disciples, they were astonished. Perhaps they were astonished that Jesus was determined to go to Jerusalem after he told them this. More likely, they were astonished at his teachings. And we can see the same word was used for the crowd that witnessed him driving out an unclean spirit in Mark chapter 1, verse 27. The disciples were at a loss for words and lagged behind Jesus as he was walking ahead of them. They didn't know what to make of all this. They were, I guess, dumbfounded. And the others who followed him, they were afraid. Now, this word was used both of fear and in a negative sense, and a reverence or respect in a positive sense. So fear can be used different ways, okay? Their fear may have been because they sensed something was about to happen in Jerusalem. Jesus took the 12 aside and began to explain to them the things that would happen to him in Jerusalem. Now let's look at verses 33 through 34 now. See, we are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, spit on him, and flog him, and kill him, and he will rise again after 3 days. In Mark chapter 8, verse 31, Jesus had spoken of his arrest and his death. He reiterated it in chapter 10, verse 33, noting that he would be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they would condemn him to death. In Mark chapter 9, verse 31, Jesus added the detail that he would be betrayed. Now here, he added the additional detail that the Gentiles would mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And that's exactly what they did. And after 3 predictions of Jesus' death, it included the fact that he would rise again. Now, so let me tell you something here. The church often separates these two events, but Jesus kept them together. The death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus were viewed as one event rather than 3 separate events. Now, why did the disciples not recall this and take hope after Jesus' death? They hid in fear. Why? They did not understand his death and couldn't understand the resurrection either. One day, they would understand that the death, burial, and resurrection was at the heart of the gospel. And that's what we need to remember today. That is the heart of the Gospels. Now, why do you think the disciples continue to have trouble understanding Jesus' teachings? And how can we make that teaching plain to a world who doesn't understand? These are questions we need to kind of ask and ponder. And we'll come up with the answer if we hopefully and truthfully pray to God. Now, let's move on. We're going to go to Mark chapter 10, verse 35 through 40 now. And we're going to look at 35 through 37 to start with. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, approached him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask you." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked them. They answered him, "Allow us to sit at your right and at your left in your glory." Now the request of James and John indicated their lack of comprehension of Jesus' prediction of his death. The insensitivity of the disciples is highlighted in their statement here. "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask you." In Matthew 20, verses 20 through 21, it explains that the mother of James and John was the one who made the request. But the request from James and John, even if it was brought by their mother, was still their own request. You know, many of us would love for Jesus to be a genie in a lamp that grants wishes, that gives us 3 wishes. And we would love to have a request line to Jesus where he would do whatever we asked him to do. Now, I want you to note that James and John's request did require faith. Because Jesus said he was going to die and rise again, and they asked him to grant them something after his resurrection. So they did have faith. But they were insensitive to Jesus' prediction of his betrayal and death. At worst, they were demanding that Jesus do what they wanted him to do. That to me, that's what it seemed like the most. They wanted Jesus to do what they wanted him to do. So Jesus asked the disciples, what do you want me to do for you? The fact that he even asked was an act of grace. Jesus was under no obligation to do anything the disciples asked. Yet he pressed them to define what they were asking. James and John answered that they wanted to sit at Jesus' right hand and at his left in the glory. Perhaps they had in mind what Jesus had promised his disciples in Matthew chapter 19, verse 28, that in the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And they had already been promised that, or told that they would be sitting on a throne. But they were even asking for more. They wanted to sit on the 2 thrones closest to Jesus. Now, let me explain something about the 2 thrones closest to Jesus. The right side was the highest position of honor, and the left side was the second place of honor. So that was 2 highest positions, the 2 highest thrones that anyone will sit on, besides Jesus' throne and God's throne, okay? These were the next in line. Now let's look at verses, let me finish up at 37 here. You see, the request of disciples revealed that they had a profound misunderstanding about the kingdom of God and what awaited them in eternity. Jesus had come to establish this kingdom through his suffering and death. Ambition, not humble loyalty to Jesus, was their motive. And Jesus exposed that on the request that they made. They were ambitious. They weren't humble. Now let's look at 38 through 40. Let's see one minute here. The numbers are so small. Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We are able, they told him. Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not mine to give. Instead, it is for those for whom it has been prepared. You see that Jesus answered in terms of servitude, not ambition. Were they able to drink the cup that Jesus drank? Well, in the Old Testament, reference to the cup emphasized both suffering and the wrath of God. In Isaiah chapter 51:17, it said, wake yourself up, stand up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk the cup of his fury from the Lord's hand. Jesus would pray that this cup be taken away from him on the night before his death in the Garden of Gethsemane. Yet he surrendered. There's the servitude part. Jesus also asked if they could be baptized with the baptism that he had embraced. You see, immersion in water was an Old Testament theme of encountering the wrath and judgment of God. This was the meaning of the flood in Genesis chapter 6, and an expression of the psalmist when facing the floodwaters of God's wrath in Psalms chapter 69, verses 2 and 15. Now, would the disciples surrender to the ideal of servitude that Jesus embraced? Would they understand he was giving his life for the sins of the world? I don't think they fully understood. See, the disciples responded, we are able. History would reveal that they were indeed able to die for Christ. James would go on to become the first apostle to experience martyrdom. John would be the only apostle to die of natural causes. But he dedicated the remainder of his life after Pentecost to serving Christ and the church. Indeed, they would have the opportunity to prove that they could drink the cup. Jesus said, to sit at my right hand or left hand is not mine to give. This was a statement of Jesus' submission to his Father. It wasn't his right to say who was going to be on the left or right. He submitted to the Father because it was the Father's decision. You see, the fact that these disciples asked Jesus that question reveals their disregard for the moment. Tucked between the prediction of his coming death and the declaration of his desire to give his life, the request seems lame and self-centered. It was a play for pride and position. The disciples needed humility and submission more than power and authority. That's exactly what we need today too, folks. We need to submit. Why do you think servitude is something sometimes disgraced in modern society rather than valued or honored? I think it's because people want power and authority. They're worshiping other gods and not the true God. Let's go on and look at James 41 through 44 now. When the 10 disciples heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John. Jesus called them over and said to them, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high position act as tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant, and whosoever wants to be first among you will be a slave to all." We can see here that now ambition and pride has also affected the other 10 disciples. They were indignant when they discovered the request of James and John to sit on the right and left hand. Why should Jesus give the place of authority to James and John, but not to them? So we can see that the pride and ambition is coming in there and a little bit of anger. Jesus exposed the attitude of disciples by comparing their ambitions to the leadership style of the Gentiles. Those who ruled the Gentiles were said to lord it over them. Instead of helping others, the rulers used them. See, Jesus challenged his disciples to be different, just as he challenges us every day to be different. The standard of their authority would be not to be power, but to be servanthood. Those who wanted to become great would be to those who served others. In verses 43 through 44, Jesus used both the words for servant and the word for slave. His disciples were to give up their selfish ambitions and serve the needs of others. The one who wanted to be first in the kingdom had to become the slave to all. Folks, we need to be servants. We need to be slaves for the kingdom of God. Why does serving others set Christianity apart from other worldviews? Ask yourself that today. Let's look at verse 45 now. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. See, Jesus expressed his life's purpose in this verse. The one who most deserved to be served was the one who wrapped his whole purpose in life of serving others. He gave his life as a ransom for many. So this was not a price paid to Satan, but to God, who had stored up wrath for all those who have sinned and fallen short of his glory. Jesus would fully satisfy the wrath of God as that cup was poured upon him on the cross. You see, folks, Jesus came to serve. He served by giving his life on a cross. God raised him from the dead, displaying visual evidence that he was pleased with that sacrifice. In turn, Jesus' disciples should live out the purpose of Christ by giving their lives in service for others. Now, let me reiterate that. He's not only talking about his disciples, but all of us Christians who are disciples of Jesus. We should live out our life in the purpose that Christ lived out his life in service to others. And what effect has Jesus' service had on your life? You know, as Christians, we should humbly recognize the necessity of the death and resurrection of Jesus. We must examine our motives for serving others. And we must demonstrate Christian character by serving others. So how does Jesus' teaching about servanthood and example challenge your view of relationships? Well, ask yourself these questions today that I have asked you. And then you can zoom in on one specific way you can humble yourself and be a servant this week. God bless you all. I hope you've had a wonderful time with this lesson today. It's a good lesson on servitude and submission and serving others. Follow Jesus' teachings. God bless you all until we see each other again.